I stared at the yellow envelope in my hands, my fingers trembling as I traced the unfamiliar return address. 50 years of marriage, and I thought I knew every secret Harold kept. The carefully hidden bank statements, the mysterious phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. The business trips that seemed to multiply as we approached our golden anniversary. But nothing had prepared me for this moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Montgomery, I whispered to myself. You've been a fool. I carefully slid my finger under the seal, pulling out what looked like innocuous holiday photos. And there he was, my husband, his arm wrapped around a woman I'd never seen, surrounded by grown children with his eyes, his smile, his dimpled chin. On the back, written in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere, my beautiful family, forever grateful for these 35 years. 35 years, while I ironed his shirts, while I raised our children, while I stood by his side at company functions, playing the part of the devoted wife. I didn't cry. Not then. That would come later. Instead, I picked up the phone and called Daniel Cooper, our family attorney. Daniel, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I need to make some changes to our will. I met Harold Montgomery at Lakeside University in 1973. I was studying to become a teacher, and he was the ambitious business major everyone predicted would make it big. He pursued me with a quiet determination. Flowers delivered to my dormitory, handwritten notes slipped under my door, and promises of a future that seemed too wonderful to be true. We married the summer after graduation. Harold insisted on a lavish ceremony at Pinewood Country Club. His parents were founding members, and appearances mattered in the Montgomery family. My parents, both factory workers from the other side of Lakeside, looked uncomfortable in their Sunday best, but I was too enchanted by Harold's world to notice. Our first home was a modest starter house on Maple Street. Harold worked long hours at First Community Bank, climbing the corporate ladder with impressive speed, while I taught 4th grade at Lakeside Elementary. When Rebecca arrived 2 years later, followed by Thomas 3 years after that, we settled into the comfortable rhythm of family life. You've given me everything I could ever want, Harold would say, kissing my forehead as he headed out the door each morning. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? As Harold's career flourished, we moved to a stately Victorian on Oak Drive, the kind of home I'd only dreamed about as a child. I meticulously restored each room, planting a garden that became the envy of the neighborhood. When Harold's parents passed away, leaving him a substantial inheritance, he insisted on setting up trust funds for the children and a retirement account that would ensure we'd never want for anything. You deserve this, Ellie, he'd say, surprising me with tickets to Europe or a new piece of jewelry, after everything you've done for this family. My closest friend Patricia Henderson would shake her head in admiration. You hit the jackpot. With that one, Ellie, most husbands barely remember birthdays, let alone plan anniversary trips to Paris. I'd smile and nod, feeling both proud and somehow undeserving. Patricia had divorced 30 years ago after catching her husband with his secretary, a cliché she'd never quite lived down. Her skepticism about marriage was understandable, but I'd always believed Harold and I were different. Even when he began traveling more frequently for work, Chicago, Boston, sometimes as far as London, I never questioned his devotion. If he occasionally missed school concerts or family dinners, I reminded myself of the sacrifices necessary for success. If he seemed distracted when he was home, I attributed it to the pressures of his position. When Rebecca graduated from architecture school and Thomas earned his doctorate in history, Harold beamed with pride. Look what we've created together, he'd whisper, squeezing my hand as we watched our children accept their diplomas. As retirement approached, Harold became increasingly involved with philanthropy, establishing the Montgomery Foundation to support education initiatives in Lakeside. We became fixtures at charity galas and community events, the golden couple who'd done everything right. For our 40th anniversary, Harold surprised me with a renovation of our home's kitchen, my dream project I'd mentioned in passing years earlier. "Nothing's too good for you," he insisted, showing me the custom cabinetry and imported marble countertops. "After all, you're the heart of this home." I remember standing in that perfect kitchen, feeling a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to my eyes. How many women were blessed with such a thoughtful husband after 4 decades of marriage? As our 50th anniversary approached, Harold suggested a vow renewal ceremony followed by a reception at Pinewood Country Club. "Let's celebrate properly," he said. 5 decades deserve something special. I threw myself into the planning, selecting invitations, choosing flowers, creating a photo display chronicling our years together. Rebecca flew in from Chicago to help, bringing her husband and children. Thomas took a sabbatical from his teaching position in Boston to join us for the month leading up to the celebration. "Mom, you and Dad are what keeps me believing in forever," Rebecca said as we sorted through old photographs. "In my business, I see so many couples who barely make it to their 5th anniversary, let alone their 50th. I smiled, touching a faded picture of Harold and me on our honeymoon. It hasn't always been easy, but we've always been committed to working through the rough patches. The night before our anniversary celebration, Harold received a phone call during dinner. He excused himself, stepping onto the back porch to speak in hushed tones. When he returned, his expression was carefully neutral, but I noticed a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Just some last-minute foundation business," he replied, not quite meeting my eyes. "Nothing for you to worry about." That night, as Harold slept beside me, I found myself staring at the ceiling, a vague uneasiness settling in my chest. After 50 years, I could sense when something was off, even if I couldn't name it. But I pushed the feeling aside. Tomorrow was our celebration, the culmination of a lifetime together. Whatever was bothering Harold could wait. The ceremony was everything I'd hoped for. Standing before our friends and family, repeating vows. We'd first exchanged half a century earlier. I felt a surge of emotion that nearly overwhelmed me. Harold's voice cracked as he promised once again to love and cherish me for all the days of our lives. Our grandchildren scattered rose petals at our feet. Thomas read a poem he'd written for the occasion. Rebecca surprised us with a beautiful rendering of our first home, framed and displayed alongside photographs from every decade of our marriage. "To my parents," Thomas said, raising his glass during the reception, "who showed us that true love isn't about grand gestures, but about showing up every day through good times and bad." The guests applauded, and Harold squeezed my hand under the table. In that moment, surrounded by everyone we loved, I couldn't imagine being happier or more fulfilled. If only I'd known what was coming. The first hint appeared 3 days after the celebration. I was sorting through cards and gifts when I came across an envelope I didn't recognize, expensive stationery with no return address. Thinking it was another congratulatory note, I opened it without hesitation. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in plain font. "Ask your husband about Elaine Carter in Riverdale." I stared at the note, reading it over and over as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less ominous. Riverdale was the next town over, about 30 minutes from Lakeside. The name Elaine Carter meant nothing to me. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a cruel prank. After 50 years in the same community, we'd accumulated our share of jealousies and petty resentments. This was probably someone's idea of stirring up trouble. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as I tucked the note into my desk drawer, A small voice whispered that perhaps I should pay attention. That evening, as Harold and I prepared dinner together, I casually mentioned the neighboring town. I was thinking of checking out that new antique store in Riverdale, I said, watching his face carefully. Apparently, it's worth the drive. Harold's hand paused momentarily as he chopped vegetables, so briefly I might have imagined it. Riverdale? That's quite a way to go for antiques. There's a perfectly good shop right here in Lakeside. I suppose you're right, I conceded, noticing how he kept his eyes fixed on the cutting board. Have you been to Riverdale recently? Me? No, not for years. He scraped the vegetables into the waiting pan, his movements precise and controlled. Not much there that would interest me. The conversation moved on, but a seed of doubt had been planted. That night, I did something I'd never done in 50 years of marriage. I waited until Harold was asleep, then carefully removed his phone from the nightstand. The passcode was our anniversary date, 0624, which should have reassured me. Instead, as I opened his messages, I felt a growing sense of dread. Most were innocuous. Exchanges with colleagues, golf buddies, our children. But then I found a thread with a contact listed simply as EC. The most recent message had come in the night before our vow renewal. We need to talk. This can't continue as it has been. Harold's response, not now, after the weekend. I'll figure something out. My hands trembled as I scrolled back through. Months of exchanges, brief cryptic messages arranging meetings, discussing financial matters, occasionally mentioning the kids. Nothing explicitly damning, but enough to confirm my suspicions that EC was likely Elaine Carter. I replaced the phone exactly as I'd found it and slipped back to my side of the bed, mind racing. Part of me wanted to wake Harold immediately, demand answers, force a confession. But another part, the part that had spent 50 years building a life, a family, a reputation, counseled caution. The next morning, I told Harold I needed to run errands and would be gone most of the day. He seemed relieved, mentioning a meeting at the foundation that would keep him busy until evening. Instead of running errands, I drove to Riverdale, the anonymous note tucked in my purse. Without a specific address, I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps confirmation that my worst fears were unfounded. I stopped at a local cafe, ordered coffee, and opened my laptop. A quick search for Elaine Carter Riverdale yielded several possibilities. I was about to close the browser when a real estate listing caught my eye. A recent home sale with the agent listed as Elaine Carter, Riverdale Realty. The agency's website featured a professional photograph of a woman approximately my age, with elegantly styled silver hair and confident eyes that stared directly into the camera. There was something vaguely familiar about her features, though. I was certain we'd never met. I wrote down the address of Riverdale Realty and drove there with a growing sense of determination. The office was in a converted Victorian near the town center, painted a cheerful yellow with white trim. Through the large front window, I could see several agents working at their desks. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes, rehearsing what I might say if I went inside. In the end, I didn't have to decide. The front door opened, and Elaine Carter herself emerged, escorting a young couple to their car. She wore a tailored pantsuit and moved with the confidence of a woman accustomed to success. After the couple drove away, she turned to go back inside, and that's when she saw me. Our eyes met across the parking lot, and I knew instantly that she recognized me. Not as a potential client, not as a stranger, but as the wife of Harold Montgomery. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, with a slight nod that acknowledged some unspoken truth, she walked back into her office. I should have followed her, demanded answers, created a scene worthy of the soap operas I occasionally indulged in. Instead, I started my car and drove away, my mind whirling with possibilities, each more painful than the last. That evening, I watched Harold more carefully than I had in years. The way he loosened his tie after coming home. The careful precision with which he mixed his evening scotch. The practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes when he asked about my day. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked, settling into his armchair with the newspaper. "Not exactly," I replied, "but I think I'm getting closer." He glanced up, momentarily wary, then nodded and returned to his reading. The next morning, I called Patricia and asked if she could meet for lunch. If anyone would give me honest advice, it would be her. We met at our usual spot, a small bistro near the lake where the staff knew us well enough to bring Patricia's martini without asking. "You look terrible," she said bluntly, studying my face across the table. "What's happened?" I hesitated, then pushed the anonymous note across to her. Patricia read it, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Ellie," she said finally, "what do you know about this Elaine person?" "Almost nothing," I admitted. "But I went to Riverdale yesterday. I saw her, and she definitely knew who I was." Patricia took a long sip of her drink. "Have you confronted Harold?" "Not yet. I need more information first." She nodded, understanding the caution of a woman who'd built her life around a relationship she was now questioning. "Do you want me to make some calls? I still know people in Riverdale from my real estate days." I hesitated, then nodded. "Just be discreet. If I'm wrong about this." "And if you're right?" Patricia asked softly. I had no answer for that. 3 days later, Patricia called and asked if she could come over. Harold was at a foundation meeting, so I invited her to the house, sensing from her tone that whatever she'd discovered wasn't something she wanted to share over the phone. She arrived with a folder and an expression that confirmed my worst fears. "I'm sorry, Ellie," she said, placing the folder on my kitchen counter. "I really am." Inside were property records, newspaper clippings, and printouts from social media, fragments of a life I knew nothing about. Elaine Carter had moved to Riverdale 35 years ago, purchasing a modest home on Sycamore Lane. Shortly after, she established her real estate business, which had grown into one of the most successful in the area. But it was the personal details that made my knees buckle. Photographs from community events showing Elaine with 2 children, a son and daughter now in their early 40s. The son, Jason, had Harold's distinctive cleft chin. The daughter, Sophia, had his eyes, his smile. And then the final piece, a birth certificate for Jason Carter, born 35 years ago. Father, Harold Montgomery. Patricia caught me as I swayed, guiding me to a chair. "Breathe, Ellie. Just breathe." I stared at the documents spread before me, fragments of a parallel life that had existed alongside mine for decades. All those business trips, all those late meetings, all those weekends at conferences that couldn't possibly include spouses. 35 years, I whispered. Our children were still young. We'd just bought this house. Patricia squeezed my hand. "What are you going to do?" Before I could answer, we heard the front door open. Harold's voice called out, "Ellie, is someone here? There's another car in the driveway." Patricia and I locked eyes. She quickly gathered the documents, sliding them back into the folder. "Your choice," she whispered. "Confront him now or wait." In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. "Leave the folder," I said quietly, "and thank you." Patricia nodded, understanding. She slipped out the back door just as Harold entered the kitchen. "Was someone here?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Just Patricia," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. She dropped something off for me to look at. Harold glanced at the folder on the counter but didn't comment. "I'm going to shower before dinner," he said, heading toward the stairs. "Harold!" I called after him, unable to stop myself. He turned, eyebrows raised in question. "Do we know anyone named Elaine Carter?" The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. For a long moment, he said nothing, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then, with visible effort, he composed himself. "Should I?" he asked, his voice tight. "I thought perhaps she was connected to the foundation," I lied, smoothly. "The name came up somewhere." Harold shook his head. "No one by that name is involved with the foundation." He turned to go, then paused. "Why do you ask?" I forced a casual shrug. "Just curious. It seemed familiar somehow." He nodded stiffly and disappeared upstairs. I waited until I heard the shower running, then opened the folder again, staring at the evidence of my husband's betrayal. Not a brief affair. Not a momentary lapse. A second family, maintained and supported for 35 years. A third of our marriage spent living a double life. That night, as Harold slept beside me, or pretended to, I made a plan. The next morning, I called Daniel Cooper and scheduled an appointment for the following day. Then I spent hours researching our assets, reviewing our will, and trying to piece together how Harold had managed his deception financially. What I discovered was both impressive and devastating. Harold had established a series of accounts and investments that channeled money to Riverdale systematically but discreetly. Nothing significant enough to raise red flags, but substantial over time. He'd listed these as foundation expenses or business investments, trusting that I wouldn't look too closely at the details, and I hadn't. I'd trusted him completely. When I arrived at Daniel's office the next afternoon, I was armed with questions and a determination to protect myself and our legitimate children from whatever fallout was coming. Daniel greeted me warmly, his expression shifting to concern as he noticed my demeanor. "Ellie, is everything all right? Harold isn't with you?" "No," I said firmly. "This meeting is just for me, and I need absolute confidentiality, even from my husband." Daniel's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. "Of course, attorney-client privilege applies." I placed Patricia's folder on his desk. "I need to understand my options, and I need to make changes to our will, immediately." Daniel Cooper leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he examined the contents of the folder. His expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight widening of his eyes, the momentary tightening of his jaw as he processed what he was seeing. "Mrs. Montgomery," he said finally, closing the folder with deliberate care. "I want to be absolutely clear about what you're showing me. These documents suggest that your husband has maintained a separate household, a separate family, in Riverdale, for over 3 decades. Is that your understanding as well?" I nodded, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to hide their trembling. "Yes, and I believe he's been diverting family funds to support them throughout our marriage." Daniel reached for a legal pad, making quick notes. "When did you discover this information?" "The first hint came just days after our 50th anniversary. Celebration, an anonymous note." I recounted the sequence of events, the message about Elaine Carter, my trip to Riverdale, Patricia's investigation, the birth certificate listing Harold as Jason Carter's father. "And you haven't confronted your husband directly?" "Not yet. I wanted to understand my options first." Daniel nodded approvingly. "A wise decision. Emotions can complicate legal matters." He tapped his pen against the desk. "Your joint assets are substantial, Ellie. The family home, investment portfolios, retirement accounts, the Montgomery Foundation. Harold's conduct constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty to the marital estate. In simple terms, he's been misappropriating marital assets." "What can I do?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Several things. First, we can file for divorce on grounds of adultery, which would likely entitle you to a more favorable settlement given the circumstances. Second, we can petition for a forensic accounting of all finances for the past 35 years to Identify exactly how much has been diverted. Third, and I recommend this regardless of what else you decide, we can immediately revise your will to protect your interests and those of Rebecca and Thomas. The word divorce hung in the air between us. 50 years of marriage, dissolving in a lawyer's office on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself. Let's start with the will, I said. I'm not ready to make other decisions yet. Daniel nodded, pulling out a copy of our existing will. Currently, your estate plan is fairly straightforward. Upon death, all assets pass to the surviving spouse. After both you and Harold are deceased, the estate is divided equally between Rebecca and Thomas, with provisions for your grandchildren's education. And the foundation? Harold is the primary trustee, with you as secondary. After your deaths, Rebecca would assume control. I considered this information. Can we change the will without Harold's knowledge? Daniel hesitated. You can create a new will that supersedes your joint will, but Harold would ultimately learn of the changes after your death, or his if you predecease him. There's no way to keep the changes permanently confidential. I understand, I said. I don't need it to remain secret forever, just long enough for me to decide what to do next. For the next 2 hours, Daniel and I reconstructed my estate plan. I removed Harold as my primary beneficiary, instead directing that my share of our assets be placed in a trust for Rebecca and Thomas. I specified that the house on Oak Drive, which had been purchased partly with money I'd inherited from my parents, should pass directly to our children, not to Harold. I resigned as secondary trustee of the Montgomery Foundation, leaving Harold to manage his philanthropic legacy alone. What about Harold's other children? Daniel asked delicately as he made the final notes. Do you wish to acknowledge them in any way? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't considered that Jason and Sophia Carter might have legal claims as Harold's biological children. They're strangers to me, I said finally. Whatever relationship Harold has with them is his concern, not mine. Daniel nodded, making a note. I'll have these changes drafted immediately. You can return tomorrow to sign the documents. As I stood to leave, he added gently, Ellie, I've known you and Harold for 30 years. This situation is unprecedented. Have you considered speaking with someone, professionally, about how to process this? I appreciated his concern, but shook my head. Not yet. First, I need facts. Then I'll deal with the feelings. The drive home felt surreal. The same streets I'd traveled for decades now seemed foreign, as if I were seeing Lakeside through a stranger's eyes. The Victorian homes with their carefully tended gardens, the country club where we'd celebrated our anniversary, the elementary school where I'd taught, where our children had learned to read and write. Every landmark was now colored by the knowledge that my life had been built on a foundation of lies. Harold's car was in the driveway when I arrived home. I sat for a moment, gathering my courage before walking inside. He was in the kitchen preparing dinner, an unusual occurrence that immediately put me on alert. There you are, he said, his voice overly cheerful. I was wondering where you'd disappeared to this afternoon. I had some errands, I replied, setting my purse on the counter, deliberately close to the folder Patricia had left. I watched his eyes flick toward it, then away. I thought we could have a nice dinner, just the two of us, he continued, stirring something on the stove. I picked up that Pinot Noir you like. I studied him, this man I'd shared my life with for half a century. The silver hair I'd watched gradually replace the dark brown. The laugh lines around eyes that had witnessed our children's births, our grandchildren's first steps, the hands that had held mine through funerals, illnesses, celebrations. Why are you cooking, Harold? I asked quietly. He glanced up, a too bright smile fixed in place. Can't a man surprise his wife once in a while? After 50 years, there's a difference between a surprise and an anomaly. His stirring slowed, then stopped. He set the spoon down carefully. Ellie, is something wrong? In that moment, I almost lost my resolve. It would be so easy to pretend, to accept the dinner, the wine, the illusion of normalcy, to push the knowledge of Elaine Carter and her children back into the shadows where it had lived for 35 years. But I'd spent my life teaching children to face difficult truths, to take responsibility for their actions. I couldn't hold my husband to a lower standard. I know about Riverdale, I said simply. Harold's face went completely blank, as if someone had wiped away all expression. For several seconds, he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to breathe. Then he reached for his wine glass, took a long sip, and set it down with exaggerated, "Karim, what exactly do you think you know?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. I know about Elaine Carter, I said, watching him flinch at the name. I know about Jason and Sophia. I know you've been living a double life for 35 years, Harold. What I don't know is why. He closed his eyes briefly, his shoulders sagging as if a great weight had suddenly descended upon them. When he opened them again, I was startled by the naked relief in his expression. I've wondered for years when this moment would come, he said quietly. Part of me has been waiting for it, perhaps even hoping for it. You wanted to be caught? I demanded, incredulous. He shook his head. Not caught, no, but the deception. It wears on you, Ellie. Living two lives, loving two families, always calculating, always remembering which version of yourself you're supposed to be. There were days I could barely keep track of the lies. Then why continue? I asked, my voice rising despite my determination to remain calm. Why not end it, one way or another? Harold moved to the table, pulling out a chair and sinking into it. He looked suddenly older, diminished. Sit down, please, he said. If we're finally having this conversation, we should do it properly. I hesitated, then took the seat across from him. Harold poured wine into a second glass and pushed it toward me. I ignored it. It started 36 years ago, he began, his voice distant, as if recalling events that had happened to someone else. That banking conference in Chicago. I told you it was a week long, but it was really just 3 days. On the 4th day, I took a side trip to a small town outside the city to look at a potential investment property. Elaine was the real estate agent. She was different. Not like anyone I'd met before. Different from me, you mean? I said. Flatly. Harold winced. Not better, just different. Ambitious in a way you never wanted to be. Challenging in ways that sometimes reminded me of my mother. He sighed. We had dinner to discuss the property. One dinner became 2. By the end of the week, we'd... Spare me the details, I interrupted. I can fill in the blanks. He nodded, staring into his wine glass. It should have ended there. A brief indiscretion, regrettable, but not life-altering. But then she called me 2 months later. She was pregnant. I felt as if I'd been struck. And you never questioned whether the child was yours? Never asked for proof? Of course I did, Harold said, looking offended. I'm not a complete fool, Ellie. But the timing, it all added up. And when Jason was born, he looked so much like me as a baby. The same chin, the same birthmark on his shoulder. There was no doubt. So you decided to set up a second household? A second family? That was your solution? Harold ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache despite everything. I panicked. We had young children. Your teaching career was just taking off. The scandal would have devastated everyone, I thought. I truly believed I was protecting you and the kids by keeping it quiet. Protecting us, I repeated, the bitterness rising in my throat. By lying to us for decades. by diverting family funds to support your mistress and illegitimate child. Children, Harold corrected quietly. Sophia came 3 years later. I stood abruptly, unable to remain seated. You had a second child with her? After the first was supposedly an accident? Harold had the grace to look ashamed. By then, things had. I evolved. Elaine had moved to Riverdale to be closer to Lakeside. It made it easier for me to see Jason regularly. And we fell into a pattern. A relationship. While still married to me, I clarified, pacing the kitchen. While coming home to me every night, or most nights. While celebrating anniversaries and birthdays and Christmases with our family. Yes, he admitted. It was wrong, Ellie. I know that. I've always known that. But it became impossible to extricate myself from either situation without causing tremendous pain. I stopped pacing and faced him directly. So instead, you lived a lie. For 35 years. Do they know about us? Does Elaine know she's been your mistress, not your wife, for 3.5 decades? Harold's expression tightened. Elaine has always known about you, about our family. She accepted the limitations of our relationship from the beginning. How generous of her, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. And Jason and Sophia? What do they believe? They know I have another family, Harold said quietly. They've always known I was married, that I had other children. I never lied to them about that. The irony struck me with such force that I laughed. A harsh, broken sound that made Harold flinch. So you were honest with your secret family about having a primary family, but you never told your primary family about your secret one. How convenient for you. Harold stood, reaching toward me. Ellie, please. I stepped back sharply. Don't touch me. Don't you dare touch me. His hand fell to his side. What happens now? He asked, his voice small. It was a fair question. What did happen next? How did one dismantle a 50-year marriage? How did one process a betrayal of this magnitude? I don't know, I answered honestly. But I know this. I won't continue living a lie. Rebecca and Thomas deserve to know the truth. They have half-siblings they've never met. A history they know nothing about. Harold paled visibly. You're going to tell the children? They're not children anymore, Harold. They're adults with families of their own. And yes, I'm going to tell them. Whether you're part of that conversation is up to you. He sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. This will destroy them. Our family will never recover. You should have thought of that 35 years ago, I said coldly, before you decided that having 2 families was somehow easier than choosing one. I turned to leave the kitchen, then paused in the doorway. I'm staying at Patricia's tonight. I suggest you use the time to consider how you want to handle this going forward. Ellie, Harold called after me, his voice breaking. I have loved you. Through everything, I have loved you. It wasn't a complete lie. I didn't turn around. The problem is, Harold, it wasn't a complete truth either. Patricia didn't ask questions when I arrived at her door with an overnight bag. She simply poured me a stronger drink than I would normally accept and sat with me in her sunroom as the evening shadows lengthened into night. I confronted him, I said finally, breaking the silence. He admitted everything. Patricia nodded, unsurprised. Did he try to justify it? In his way. He talked about protecting us from scandal, about not wanting to hurt anyone, as if maintaining 2 separate households for 35 years was the compassionate choice. Men, Patricia said, with the weary disgust of someone who'd seen it all before. They twist themselves into logical pretzels to avoid admitting they're just selfish. I sipped my drink, welcoming the warm burn of alcohol. The thing that keeps circling in my mind isn't even the affair or the children. It's the deception. The calculated, continuous lying. Every morning for 35 years, he woke up and consciously chose to maintain this elaborate fiction. How do you do that to someone you claim to love? Patricia had no answer, and I didn't really expect one. Some questions couldn't be answered by anyone except the person who'd created the situation in the first place. That night, in Patricia's guest room, I dreamed of earlier days, of Harold and me dancing at our wedding, of picnics with toddler Rebecca and baby Thomas, of family vacations at the lake, the Saii. In my dream, all these memories were projected on a screen, like a movie, and with each scene, the image became increasingly transparent, revealing another family, Elaine, Jason, Sophia, mirroring our activities behind the screen. I woke, gasping. Drenched in sweat, the boundary between dreams and reality momentarily blurred. The next morning, I returned to Daniel Cooper's office as planned. The revised will was ready for my signature, along with several other legal documents he had prepared. I've included a power of attorney that removes Harold's ability to act on your behalf, Daniel explained, sliding the papers across his desk. And I've drafted letters to your bank and investment firms instructing them to require your signature on any transactions over $5,000, even from joint accounts. I signed where indicated, feeling a strange detachment as I formally dismantled the financial structure of my marriage. What happens when Harold discovers these changes? Legally, nothing. You're entitled to protect your assets. Practically speaking, however, it will force a conversation about your financial future. We had that conversation last night, I said, signing the final document. At least, we started it. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You confronted him? Yes, he admitted everything. He's been maintaining this second family since Rebecca was 7 and Thomas was 4. Apparently, his mistress was pregnant after a week-long affair. Daniel's professional composure slipped momentarily. I've known Harold for 30 years, he said, shaking his head. I never would have suspected. Neither did I said quietly. And I've been married to him for 50. After finalizing the legal paperwork, I drove to Rebecca's hotel. She had stayed in Lakeside after the anniversary celebration, extending her vacation to spend time with old friends. Thomas had already returned to Boston, a blessing given what I was about to share. Rebecca answered her door in workout clothes, clearly just returned from the hotel gym. Her smile faded as she took in my expression. Mom, what's wrong? Is it Dad? We need to talk, I said, stepping into her room. It's complicated, and it's not going to be easy to hear. Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed, her body tensing as if preparing for a physical blow. You're scaring me. Is someone sick? Is it cancer? I almost laughed at the irony, how a medical diagnosis, even a serious one, would have been easier to deliver than this. No, nothing like that. It's about your father, about our marriage. Slowly, carefully, I laid out what I had discovered, the anonymous note, the investigation, the evidence of Harold's second family in Riverdale, the confirmation from Harold himself. As I spoke, Rebecca's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to a cold, contained fury that reminded me startlingly of her father. 35 years, she repeated when I finished. I was 7 years old when he started this. This double life? I nodded, reaching for her hand. She pulled away. And these people, this woman and her children, they knew about us? They knew he was married with a family? Apparently so. Rebecca stood abruptly, pacing the hotel room much as I had paced our kitchen the night before. All those business trips, all those late meetings, all the times he missed school events because he was working so hard for our future. He wasn't working, was he? He was with them. Some of the time, yes, I admitted. Though I believe he tried to minimize the overlap. According to Patricia's research, he purchased the house in Riverdale for Elaine, but he doesn't appear to live there consistently, more like regular visits. Rebecca's laugh was harsh, bitter. Oh, well, that makes it so much better. He only lives part-time with his second family. Father of the Year. I watched my daughter process this betrayal, her emotions cycling visibly across her face. In many ways, she was taking it harder than I had. Perhaps because her image of her father had been less complicated than mine. She'd seen only his strengths, his devotion to our family, his support of her ambitions. She hadn't experienced the small disappointments, the minor fractures that even the best marriages accumulate over decades. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally, her voice steadier. "Are you leaving him?" "I don't know yet," I said, honestly. "I've made some legal arrangements to protect myself financially. I spent last night at Patricia's, but I haven't decided on the long term." Rebecca sat beside me again, taking my hand. "Whatever you decide, Thomas and I will support you. 100%. I squeezed her fingers gratefully. "Your father wants to speak with both of you. He's afraid. He's afraid this will destroy your relationship with him." "It might," Rebecca said bluntly. "I can't even imagine looking him in the eye right now, let alone having a conversation about his secret family." "Take some time," I advised. "Process this however you need to. But eventually, you'll have to talk to him." "And what about them?" she asked, her voice hardening. "These half-siblings we apparently have? Are we supposed to form some kind of blended family now? Play nice at holidays? Pretend this isn't the most twisted situation imaginable?" It was a fair question, and one I had no answer for. "That's entirely up to you and Thomas. They're strangers. To us, but they share your father's blood. What that means going forward." "I don't know." Rebecca leaned against me, resting her head on my shoulder as she had done as a child seeking comfort. "I can't believe he did this to us. To you. How could he, Mom? How could he lie to us for so long?" I stroked her hair, finding strength in the need to comfort my child. People can justify almost anything if they try hard enough. Your father convinced himself he was protecting everyone by maintaining the status quo. Once a deception begins, it becomes increasingly difficult to find a way out. "That's not an excuse," Rebecca said, straightening. "No," I agreed. "It's not." We sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Rebecca asked, "Have you told Thomas yet?" "No. I wanted to tell you in person. First, I'll call Thomas tonight." Rebecca nodded. "I'll call him too. He shouldn't hear this alone over the phone." "Thank you," I said, grateful for her strength, her practical nature even in crisis. "You're a good sister, a good daughter." Her eyes filled with tears at that. "I'm trying to understand how someone can compartmentalize their life like this. How you can love two families, two sets of children. How you can come home and tell bedtime stories and help with homework, all while knowing you have other children across town who also need you." It was the same question I'd been grappling with since the discovery. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm not sure I'll ever understand it fully." When I left Rebecca's hotel room 3 hours later, we had formulated a plan. She would fly to Boston the following day to be with Thomas when I called to share the news. They would decide together whether they wanted to meet with Harold and under what circumstances. In the meantime, I would return home, to the house that had been the center of our family life for decades, but now felt like a museum of carefully crafted lies. Harold was waiting when I arrived, sitting in the living room with an untouched glass of scotch beside him. He looked as if he hadn't slept, his face gray with exhaustion, eyes bloodshot. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said, quietly as I set down my bag. "This is my home too," I replied. "I'm not the one who should leave." He nodded, accepting this. "Have you told the children?" "Rebecca. I'll call Thomas tonight with Rebecca's support." I studied him, this stranger I'd shared my life with. "She's devastated, Harold. They both will be." He closed his eyes briefly. "I know. I never wanted to hurt them. Or you. You have to believe that. What I believe, I said, taking the seat across from him, is that you made choices. Thousands of them, over decades. Each time you left our house to go to Riverdale. Each time you missed a family event to be with them. Each time you diverted our money to support them. Those weren't accidents or misunderstandings. They were deliberate decisions. Harold didn't deny it. He stared into his untouched scotch, shoulders slumped in defeat. What do you want from me now, Ellie? An apology seems inadequate. A promise. To end things with Elaine seems 35 years too late. What can I possibly do to make this right? It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself throughout the sleepless night at Patricia's. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? Some form of restitution for the years of deception? I want the truth, I said finally. All of it. No more lies, no more omissions. I want to understand how this happened, how it continued for so long, what it means for our future, if we even have one. Harold nodded slowly. The truth. After a lifetime of lies, I suppose that's the least I owe you. For the next several hours, as evening faded into night, Harold talked. He described meeting Elaine Carter at that Chicago property, showing the immediate attraction, the brief affair that he'd intended to leave behind. The phone call 2 months later that changed everything. His panic, his rationalization that a quiet financial arrangement would be cleaner than a messy public scandal. I told myself it would be temporary, he explained, his voice hoarse from talking. That I'd support the child financially, but remain distant emotionally. That my real life was with you and Rebecca and Thomas. What changed? I asked. Jason was born, Harold said simply. I went to the hospital, just to confirm he was mine, to make arrangements for support. But when I saw him, his voice broke. He was my son, Ellie. My flesh and blood. I couldn't just write checks from a distance. I needed to know him. I listened as Harold described establishing Elaine and Jason in Riverdale, close enough to visit regularly but far enough to minimize the risk of discovery. How monthly check-ins became weekly visits. How professional support evolved into a continued relationship with Elaine. And Sophia? I prompted when he paused. Another accident? Harold had the decency to look ashamed. No. After years of raising Jason together, of building a life in Riverdale, Elaine wanted another child. She argued that Jason should have a sibling, that our arrangement had proven stable and sustainable. So you decided to intentionally father another child with your mistress while still married to me? I clarified, my voice tight with anger. While still coming home to your first family, still celebrating anniversaries, still sharing my bed. Yes, Harold admitted. It was selfish. Unforgivably selfish. As the grandfather clock in our hallway chimed midnight, Harold's story continued to unfold. The elaborate system of lies and omissions he'd constructed to maintain both households. The careful financial arrangements to support Elaine and the children without raising red flags. The compartmentalization that allowed him to be fully present in each home without constant guilt overwhelming him. The human mind is remarkably adaptable, he said, staring past me into the darkness beyond our windows. After a while, the deception becomes routine. You stop questioning it. You convince yourself that what you're doing is normal, even necessary. Was it worth it? I asked suddenly. All the lies, all the juggling, all the stress of maintaining two separate lives. When you look back now, was it worth what you're about to lose? Harold met my gaze directly for the first time in hours. I don't know, he said honestly. I love my children, all 4 of them. I've loved both you and Elaine in different ways. But the cost? He shook his head. The cost has been higher than I ever imagined. It was nearly 2 a.m. when we finally exhausted the immediate questions, the logistics of his deception. We sat in silence for several minutes. The weight of 50 years, and 35 years of lies hanging between us. "Where do we go from here?" Harold asked finally. I stood, suddenly bone-weary. "I don't know, but I know I can't decide tonight. I'm going to bed, in the guest room. We'll continue this conversation when I've had some sleep." Harold nodded, not challenging my decision to sleep separately. As I reached the doorway, he called after me softly, "Ellie?" I paused but didn't turn. "Thank you for listening," he said. "For wanting to understand. You could have just walked away." I glanced back at him. This man who had been the center of my world for half a century, who had fathered my children, who had held my hand through life's hardest moments, and who had betrayed me more profoundly than I could have imagined. 50 years isn't something you just walk away from, I said. Even when you discover it wasn't what you thought it was. That night, in the guest bedroom that had hosted countless visitors but never me, I stared at the ceiling and contemplated the ruins of my marriage. The foundations had been shaken, the structure compromised beyond easy repair. Yet something still remained. 5 decades of shared history, 2 children, 7 grandchildren, a community that knew us as a unit. Could anything be salvaged from such complete betrayal? Should anything be salvaged? Or was it time to clear the rubble and start again, alone, at 72? Sleep eluded me as questions circled endlessly. In the quiet hours before dawn, I made a decision that surprised even me. When morning came, I would drive to Riverdale. I would meet Elaine Carter face to face. I would look into the eyes of the woman who had shared my husband for 35 years, and I would decide what my future held. The morning light filtered through unfamiliar curtains, momentarily disorienting me as I woke in the guest bedroom. For a blessed few seconds, my mind was empty, peaceful. Then reality crashed back, bringing with it the leaden weight of knowledge. My husband of 50 years had another family, another life, another love. I dressed with methodical precision, selecting a navy pantsuit that had always given me confidence in difficult situations. When I emerged, Harold was in the kitchen, his face haggard from what appeared to be a sleepless night. "Coffee?" he offered, lifting the pot. A peace offering of sorts. I shook my head. "I'm going out." His eyes tracked me warily. "Where?" "Riverdale." The coffee pot clattered against the counter as his hand jerked involuntarily. "Ellie, that's not a good idea." "I didn't ask your opinion," I replied, my voice level. "I need to see her." "Why?" His voice cracked on the single syllable. What could that possibly accomplish except more pain? I regarded him steadily, taking in the slumped shoulders, the shadowed eyes, the nervous twitch of his fingers against the countertop. For the first time in our marriage, Harold looked genuinely afraid. "For 50 years you've controlled the narrative of our lives," I said quietly. "You decided what I knew, what I didn't know, what I was allowed to see. That ends today." "At least let me call her first," he pleaded. "Give her some warning." "The way you warned me?" I interrupted, my calm facade cracking momentarily. "The way someone had to send me an anonymous note because you lacked the courage to tell me yourself?" He flinched as if I'd struck him. "Ellie, please, give me her address," I said. "Unless you'd prefer I drive around Riverdale asking questions until I find her." Defeated, Harold scribbled an address on a notepad and tore off the page. 456 Sycamore Lane, he said, sliding it across the counter. "But Ellie, she won't be expecting you. This could get complicated." I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my purse. "Our entire marriage has been complicated, Harold. I'm just finally seeing the full picture." The drive to Riverdale took 35 minutes. The same 35 minutes Harold had driven countless times over the decades, leaving one life to step into another. As the miles passed, I rehearsed what I might say to Elaine Carter, but every imagined conversation felt inadequate to the situation. Sycamore Lane was a pleasant, tree-lined street of modest but well-maintained homes. Number 456 was a two-story colonial painted sage green with white trim, its front yard meticulously landscaped with flowering shrubs and a small Japanese maple. A silver Volvo sat in the driveway, practical, understated, not unlike my own car. The normalcy of it all was somehow more disturbing than if I'd found some flashy mistress's lair. I sat in my car for several long minutes, gathering courage. Through the front window, I could see movement inside the house, someone passing through the living room, unaware they were being observed. Finally, I stepped out of the car and walked up the stone path to the front door. The doorbell chimed pleasantly inside. Footsteps approached, and then the door swung open to reveal Elaine Carter. In person, she was more striking than in her real estate photograph, tall and slender, with silver hair cut in an elegant bob. She wore tailored slacks and a cashmere sweater, simple pearl earrings her only jewelry. She looked like someone I might have befriended at a community fundraiser or book club. Recognition was immediate. Her eyes widened, her lips parted in surprise, one hand rising to grip the doorframe for support. "Mrs. Montgomery," she said, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "Ms. Carter," I replied. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other. Two women in their 70s, linked by decades of shared connection to the same man, yet strangers to each other. "I suppose you'd better come in," she said finally, stepping back to allow me entry. The interior of the house was tastefully decorated in neutral tones, with built-in bookshelves flanking a stone fireplace. Family photos dotted the surfaces, Harold with a young boy on his shoulders, Harold beside a teenage girl at what appeared to be a graduation, Harold and Elaine smiling at the camera, his arm around her waist. My stomach lurched at these visual confirmations of his double life, but I forced myself to maintain composure. Elaine led me to a sitting area by the fireplace, gesturing toward an armchair while she took the sofa opposite. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, the practiced hostess. "Coffee? Tea?" "I didn't come for refreshments," I said. She nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "No, I don't suppose you did." She studied me, her gaze direct and unapologetic. "How did you find out? After all this time?" "Someone sent me a note. After our 50th anniversary celebration." Something flickered in Elaine's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "I see. And Harold? Does he know you're here?" "Yes." She nodded again, accepting this. "I've wondered for years what would happen if this moment ever came. What I would say to you, how I would explain." She trailed off, looking at her hands. "I'm not sure there is an explanation that would satisfy me," I said. "But I'm here to listen if you'd like to try." Elaine's gaze returned to mine, measuring, evaluating. Then she seemed to come to a decision. I never intended to become involved with a married man. That wasn't who I was, who I am. But Harold, he was different, attentive in a way I'd never experienced. And when I discovered I was pregnant, he didn't run. He didn't deny responsibility. He stepped up in his way. By establishing a second household, a second family, while remaining married to me? Yes, she admitted. It wasn't ideal, obviously, but it seemed better than the alternatives. A bitter divorce, children caught in the crossfire, financial ruin. Those were his concerns, I pointed out. His justifications. What about yours? Elaine hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I loved him, almost immediately with an intensity that surprised me. And later, I loved our family, the life we built together, unconventional as it was. She met my gaze squarely. "I won't apologize for loving my children's father, Mrs. Montgomery, but I am sorry for the pain this has caused you." The practiced sincerity of her apology grated against my raw emotions. Did you ever consider what this arrangement was costing me? The lies, the absences, the divided loyalty? Of course, she said, her voice softening. More than you might think. But in the beginning, it was easy to see you as an abstraction, the wife, the obstacle. By the time I began to understand the real implications, we were already entrenched. In this life. Jason was in school. Harold was established in both households. The path of least resistance was to continue. The path of least resistance, I repeated, the phrase igniting a fresh surge of anger. How convenient that the easiest path for you and Harold required me to live a lie without my knowledge or consent. Elaine didn't flinch from my anger. You're right, she said simply. It was deeply unfair to you. If it helps at all, I have never fooled myself into thinking otherwise. Before I could respond, the front door opened, and a male voice called out, Mom, are you home? I brought those paint samples you wanted to see. Elaine's face paled. Jason, she said quietly, just as a man in his mid-30s appeared in the doorway. The resemblance to Harold was striking. The same cleft chin, the same set of the shoulders, the same way of tilting his head slightly when confused. He looked between Elaine and me, his expression shifting from curiosity to dawning comprehension. Mom, he said, his voice uncertain. Elaine stood, moving to his side. Jason, this is Mrs. Montgomery. Eleanor, Harold's wife. Jason's eyes widened, his gaze returning to me with new intensity. For a long moment, no one spoke, the silence heavy with unasked questions and unspoken accusations. I should go, I said finally, rising from my chair. No, please, Jason said quickly. Don't leave on my account. I've wondered about you for a long time. The simple statement, delivered without hostility, caught me off guard. I sank back into my seat, suddenly aware of a complexity I hadn't anticipated. This man wasn't just Harold's secret son. He was a person who had grown up knowing his father had another family, a primary family, elsewhere. You knew about me? About Rebecca and Thomas? Jason nodded, moving into the room to sit beside his mother. Dad never lied to us about that. He was always clear that he had a wife and other children, that our situation was unusual. And how did that make you feel? I asked, genuinely curious. He considered the question, his expression thoughtful. Confused when I was younger, angry as a teenager. But eventually, I came to accept it as our normal. Dad was here 2 or 3 days a week, sometimes more during vacations or holidays. He coached my little league team, helped with homework, attended school events when he could. He was present in the ways that mattered most. The casual description of Harold's involvement in this parallel family life pierced me to the core. All those baseball games, school plays, and family dinners he'd missed with Rebecca and Thomas, claiming work commitments, travel obligations, community responsibilities, had been spent here with his other children. He missed things with my children, with Rebecca and Thomas, to be here with you, I said, unable to keep the pain from my voice. Jason looked uncomfortable. I know. And as an adult, I recognize how difficult those choices must have been. But as a child, I just knew that sometimes Dad couldn't be at my events because he had obligations with his other family. His real family, I corrected sharply. Elaine straightened, her protective instinct flaring. Both families were real, Mrs. Montgomery. Different, but real. I closed my eyes briefly, the magnitude of the deception threatening to overwhelm me. When I opened them, Jason was watching me with an expression that reminded me painfully of Harold in his younger days, concerned, empathetic, slightly uncertain. I never expected to meet you, he said quietly. But I'm not sorry that I have. You're an important part of my father's life, which means you're connected to my life too, whether either of us chose that or not. His gracious response was so unexpected, so free of the bitterness I myself was struggling to contain, that I found myself momentarily speechless. This young man, no, this adult man with Harold's eyes and chin, had grown up knowing he was, in some sense, secondary. Yet he spoke without resentment, with a maturity that humbled me. "Do you have children, Jason?" I asked, my voice gentler. He nodded, a smile warming his face. "2. Emma is 7, and Michael is 4. Harold's grandchildren," I said softly. "Grandchildren I never knew existed." "He loves them very much," Jason said simply. "He takes them fishing at the lake, builds elaborate blanket forts in the living room, reads them stories with all the different character voices." He paused, then added carefully, "I imagine he was the same with your grandchildren." And he had been the devoted grandfather, never too busy for a tea party with the girls or a backyard baseball game with the boys. The realization that Harold had been equally devoted to another set of grandchildren somehow made the betrayal fresher, sharper. "This is a lot to process," I said, reaching for my purse. "I should go." "Before you do," Elaine said, "may I ask what you intend to do with this information? Are you planning to divorce Harold?" The directness of the question startled me. "I haven't decided," I answered honestly. "But I've already changed my will and taken steps to protect myself financially." Elaine nodded, unsurprised. "Of course, that's completely reasonable." "And what about you?" I countered. "What do you hope happens now that everything is in the open?" Elaine exchanged a glance with Jason before responding. "I've loved Harold for 35 years, knowing I would never be his only priority. I accepted those terms long ago. Whatever you decide, whatever he decides, I'll adapt. I always have." Her calm acceptance irritated me. It was as if she'd spent decades preparing for this moment, while I'd been blindsided, left scrambling to make sense of a reality I'd never suspected. "How convenient for both of you," I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "You've had 35 years to prepare for this revelation. I've had less than a week." Jason stood, extending his hand to help me up. Another gesture so reminiscent of Harold that it sent a pang through my chest. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Montgomery, I'm sorry you've been hurt by this. You didn't deserve it." I looked at this man, Harold's son, but not my son, and saw genuine compassion in his eyes. Despite myself, I took his offered hand and stood. "Thank you, Jason. That means something, coming from you." As Elaine walked me to the door, she paused with her hand on the knob. "This may be presumptuous of me, but Harold is a good man who made a profound mistake. A mistake that grew and complicated over decades until it became unmanageable. He's loved both of us, in different ways, and he's been a good father to all his children." "Are you asking me to forgive him?" I asked, incredulous. She shook her head. "No, that's not my place. I'm simply offering another perspective on the man we've both built our lives around." She opened the door, then added quietly, "Whatever you decide, Eleanor, I hope you find peace with it." The drive home felt surreal, as if I were returning from a visit to some parallel dimension where everything looked normal but was fundamentally altered. I had expected to hate Elaine Carter, to find her cheap, manipulative, grasping. Instead, I'd met a composed, intelligent woman who had built a life within the constraints Harold had established, who had raised his children to be thoughtful, adults who spoke of him with a complexity of feeling that mirrored my own. It would have been easier if I could have dismissed her as a predatory homewrecker. The reality was far more complicated, and in some ways, more painful. Harold was waiting when I returned, pacing the living room with obvious anxiety. He froze when I entered, searching my face for clues about the encounter. "You saw her," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. And Jason." Harold sank into a chair, his expression a mix of resignation and dread. "How was it?" "Enlightening," I said, settling on the sofa across from him. Your son seems like a decent man, despite the circumstances of his upbringing. He is, Harold said quietly. They both are, Jason and Sophia. They've handled a complicated situation with remarkable grace. Unlike their father, I observed. Harold accepted the barb with a slight nod. What happens now, Ellie? Where do we go from here? It was the question I'd been asking myself since the revelation. The question that had haunted my sleepless nights and distracted days. The question I still didn't have a clear answer to. I need to speak with Thomas, I said. Rebecca knows, but Thomas doesn't. Not yet. After that. I don't know. Will you let me be part of that conversation? With Thomas. I considered the request. No, not the initial one. He deserves to hear it from me first, to process it without your justifications clouding the issue. After that, if he wants to speak with you, that's his decision. Harold accepted this with resignation. And us? Our marriage? That remains to be seen, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. 50 years isn't something I can just erase or walk away from. But neither is 35 years of deception. Harold leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. What if we tried counseling? A professional mediator to help us work through this? The suggestion was so unexpected, so unlike Harold's usual self-reliant approach to problems, that I stared at him in surprise. You would do that? I would do anything, Ellie. Anything to find a path forward with you. Even end your relationship with Elaine? With Jason and Sophia? His face contorted with genuine anguish. Don't ask me to abandon my children. Please. They've done nothing wrong. They're adults, Harold. They don't need a father's daily presence the way they did growing up. And Elaine? He asked quietly. I studied him. This man I'd loved for 5 decades, trying to see past my own pain to understand his. Do you love her? He closed his eyes briefly, then met my gaze directly. Yes, he admitted. Not in the same way I love you. It's different. It's always been different. But yes, I care for her deeply. The honest answer hurt, but I appreciated it more than another lie would have. I don't know if I can share you, Harold. Even with everything in the open. I don't know if I want to. I understand, he said. I'm not asking for an answer today. Just, please don't close the door completely. Not yet. We sat in silence. For several minutes, the weight of 50 years and 35 years of secrets hanging between us. Finally, I stood. I'm going to call Thomas now. He and Rebecca are together in Boston. They should hear this as a family. Harold nodded, remaining seated as I moved toward the study where I could speak privately. At the doorway, I paused and looked back at him. The slumped shoulders, the bowed head, the hands that still wore the wedding band I'd placed there half a century ago. When did it become real, Harold? I asked suddenly. When did it change? From a mistake you were managing to a life you were actively choosing, day after day? He looked up, his expression thoughtful despite the tension. I don't know, he said honestly. There wasn't a single moment of decision. It was 1,000 small choices, each seeming necessary or justifiable at the time. By the time I recognized the full pattern of what I'd created, it felt impossible to dismantle without causing immense pain to innocent people. People like me, I said. People like Rebecca and Thomas. Yes, he acknowledged. And later, people like Jason and Sophia, who never asked to be born into such a complicated situation. I nodded, accepting his answer without forgiveness, then continued to the study, closing the door firmly behind me. The call with Thomas and Rebecca was as difficult as I'd expected. Thomas's initial disbelief gave way to a cold, contained fury reminiscent of his father at his most controlled. Rebecca, having had time to process the revelation, provided a steady presence, stepping in when Thomas's emotions threatened to overwhelm him. "I can't believe this," Thomas said for perhaps the 5th time. 50 years of marriage, and he's been living a double life for more than half of it? How is that even possible? "Compartmentalization," Rebecca said, her voice reflecting her training as an architect. Practical, analytical. "Dad's always been good at keeping different aspects of his life separate. Work, family, community responsibilities. This is just an extreme manifestation of that trait." "That's charitable," Thomas replied, his tone scathing. "I'd call it pathological lying." "It can be both," I interjected. "Your father made choices, thousands of them, over decades, that prioritized his own desires over honesty. But he also genuinely loves all of you. Those things can coexist, as difficult as that is to accept." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, another gesture so like Harold's that it made my heart ache. "What are you going to do, Mom? Are you leaving?" "Him?" "I haven't decided," I said, the same answer I'd given everyone. "I've taken steps to protect myself financially. The rest? I need time." "Whatever you decide, we support you," Rebecca assured me. 100%. "Absolutely," Thomas agreed. "But for what it's worth, I don't think I can forgive him. Not for this. Not for lying to all of us for my entire conscious life." I nodded, understanding his position. "You don't have to decide anything right now either, Thomas. Take the time you need to process this. Your relationship with your father is separate from my relationship with him." "Are they?" Thomas asked sharply, because that's exactly the kind of compartmentalization that allowed him to maintain this deception for 35 years. He had a point, one I hadn't considered. Harold's ability to separate different aspects of his life had enabled his double life. Was I perpetuating that pattern by suggesting Thomas could maintain a relationship with his father, even if I chose to end my marriage? "I don't have all the answers," I admitted. "We're in uncharted territory here." "What about them?" Rebecca asked, her voice carefully neutral. "His other children. Have you met them?" "I met Jason today. He seems—" I hesitated, searching for the right word. "Thoughtful. Remarkably well-adjusted given the circumstances." "And the woman?" Thomas asked. "Elaine?" I considered my impression of Harold's mistress. No, his partner of 35 years. "She's intelligent, composed, not what I expected." "Are they expecting Dad to leave you and move in with them now?" Rebecca asked, the practical question, cutting to the heart of the matter. "Is that what they've been waiting for all these years?" "I don't think so," I said slowly. "From what I gathered, they've accepted their arrangement as permanent. Elaine didn't seem to be anticipating major changes, even with everything in the open." Thomas scoffed. How generous of her. We talked for another hour, covering practical considerations and emotional reactions. By the end, both Rebecca and Thomas had agreed to speak with Harold, though neither was ready to do so immediately. We set tentative plans for a family meeting. In 2 weeks, after everyone had time to process the initial shock. When I emerged from the study, Harold was still in the living room, though he'd moved to his desk in the corner. He was writing something in a leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. "Thomas knows," I said simply. Harold nodded, closing the journal. "How did he take it?" "About as well as can be expected. Better than he might have, given the circumstances." "Will he speak with me?" "Eventually. Not right away." Harold accepted this with a small nod. "Thank you, Ellie, for giving me that chance at least." I moved to the window, looking out at the garden I'd tended for decades. The roses were blooming, their pink and yellow blossoms bright against the green backdrop. I'd planted those bushes 30 years ago, around the time Sophia was born, though I hadn't known that then. "I've been thinking," I said, my back still to Harold. About what you said earlier. About counseling. I heard him shift in his chair, the leather creaking slightly. Yes? I'm willing to try, I said, surprising myself with the decision even as I voiced it. Not because I've forgiven you. I haven't. Not because I know what outcome I want. I don't. But because 50 years deserves at least the attempt at understanding, at finding some kind of resolution we can both live with. When I turned to face him, Harold's expression was a complex mixture of hope, relief, and wariness. Thank you, he said simply. It's more than I deserve. Yes, I agreed. It is. That night, I slept in the guest room again, my mind churning with the events of the day. The meeting with Elaine and Jason had shifted something in my perception, making the situation more real, but also more nuanced than the stark betrayal I'd initially perceived. The conversation with Thomas and Rebecca had reinforced my role as matriarch, as the one who needed to navigate this crisis with wisdom and care for all involved. As I drifted toward sleep, one thought crystallized with unexpected clarity. Whatever happened next, I would no longer be living in ignorance. For, better or worse, I now had access to the full reality of my life, the genuine accomplishments and joys alongside the painful deceptions. There was power in that knowledge, a foundation of truth on which to build whatever came next. Whether that meant ending my marriage, redefining it, or finding some middle path I couldn't yet envision remained to be seen. But for the first time, since discovering the yellow envelope, I felt a glimmer of control over my own story. Dr. Marianne Winter's office occupied the third floor of a renovated Victorian in downtown Lakeside. The waiting room was tastefully decorated in soothing blues and greens, with comfortable seating and subtle lighting. Still, as Harold and I sat on opposite ends of the sofa, the atmosphere felt anything but calming. It had been 2 weeks since my confrontation with Elaine, 2 weeks of strained silence and separate bedrooms, of carefully choreographed movements to avoid direct interaction within our own home. Harold had made the appointment with Dr. Winters, a therapist specializing in marriage counseling, particularly for long-term couples in crisis. Her reputation in Lakeside was sterling, though I doubted she'd encountered many situations quite like ours. Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery? The receptionist's voice broke into my thoughts. Dr. Winters is ready for you. Harold stood, then hesitated, waiting to see if I would walk beside him or insist on maintaining distance. After a moment's consideration, I rose and moved toward the door independently. Small choices now carried significance they'd never had before. Dr. Winters greeted us with professional warmth, a firm handshake, direct eye contact, a voice that conveyed authority without intimidation. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps, in her early 50s, with salt and pepper hair cut in a practical bob and wire-rimmed glasses that gave her an academic air. "Please, have a seat," she said, gesturing to 2 chairs facing her desk. Not a couch where we would sit together. Noted, but individual chairs, allowing space between us while still positioning us as a unit. The arrangement wasn't accidental. "I appreciate you both coming in today," Dr. Winters began once we were settled. "Before we start, I want to establish some ground rules for our sessions. This is a safe space for honesty, but not for cruelty. We'll speak directly but respectfully. We'll listen without interrupting. And we'll recognize that healing, whatever form that ultimately takes, requires patience and commitment from everyone involved. Does that sound reasonable?" Harold and I nodded in unison, perhaps the first thing we'd agreed on in weeks. "Good," she continued. "Now, in your intake forms, you've outlined the basic situation, a 50-year marriage, with the recent discovery of a long-term parallel relationship resulting in children. That's our starting point, but I'd like to hear from each of you about what you hope to achieve through counseling." She turned to Harold. "Mr. Montgomery, why don't you begin?" Harold cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I want to save my marriage," he said simply. "I've made terrible mistakes, choices, that have hurt Ellie profoundly. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope for understanding, perhaps. A path forward that acknowledges both the damage I've done and the 50 years we've built together." Dr. Winters nodded, then turned to me. "Mrs. Montgomery, what are your goals for our work together?" I'd given this considerable thought in the days leading up to our appointment. "I need clarity," I said, "about what our marriage has truly been, about what it could possibly be going forward. I don't know if reconciliation is possible or even desirable. But I do know that I deserve to make that decision with complete information and support." "Those are honest starting points," Dr. Winters said approvingly. "Now, I'd like each of you to share your perception of your marriage before this revelation. Mrs. Montgomery, would you like to begin this time?" I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. For 50 years, I believed we had a good marriage. Not perfect, but solid. We raised 2 wonderful children. We supported each other's goals. We weathered life's challenges together. I trusted Harold completely. I never questioned his absences because I assumed they were necessary for his work, his community involvement, our financial security. I believed we were partners in every sense of the word. Harold listened without interrupting, his expression pained but attentive. "Mr. Montgomery?" Dr. Winters prompted when I'd finished. "Everything Ellie said about our marriage is true," Harold began carefully. "We did build a good life together. I have loved her deeply for 50 years and continue to love her. The relationship with Elaine doesn't negate that, though I understand why Ellie might find that impossible to believe." "You speak of 2 simultaneous loves," Dr. Winters observed. "Can you elaborate on how you've reconciled those within yourself?" Harold shifted uncomfortably. "They're different. My relationship with Ellie is the foundation of my life. The family we've built, the history we share, the comfort of deep mutual understanding. My relationship with Elaine developed differently, initially as a response to an unexpected pregnancy, later evolving into something more complex. And the deception?" Dr. Winters pressed. "How did you manage the cognitive dissonance of maintaining such an elaborate lie for 35 years? Harold's face flushed. "Initially, I told myself it was temporary, a necessary evil to handle an unexpected situation, without destroying my marriage. But as time passed, the deception became normalized, compartmentalized. I convinced myself I was protecting everyone by maintaining separate worlds. Protecting everyone except me," I interjected, unable to remain silent. "I was never given the choice to make an informed decision about my own life." Dr. Winters nodded, acknowledging my point. "That's an important distinction, Mrs. Montgomery. The absence of informed consent is a critical factor here." She turned back to Harold. "Would you agree that you made unilateral decisions that fundamentally affected your wife's life without her knowledge?" "Yes," Harold admitted, his voice barely audible. "I did." "And how do you justify that to yourself?" she asked, not unkindly, but firmly. Harold was silent for a long moment. "I can't," he finally said. "Not anymore. At the time, I created elaborate justifications. That Ellie would be devastated by the truth, that the children would suffer, that everyone was better off with the status quo. But those were self-serving rationalizations, not genuine concern for others." His admission, so direct, so unqualified, caught me by surprise. In our private conversations, he had always maintained some defense, some explanation of his actions, as misguided but well-intentioned. This complete acceptance of responsibility was new. "That's a significant acknowledgement," Dr. Winters said. "Mrs. Montgomery, what's your reaction to hearing that?" I considered the question carefully. It helps, I said slowly, to hear him admit that the deception was selfish rather than protective. But it doesn't change the fact that I spent half my life in a marriage that wasn't what I believed it to be. Understandably, Dr. Winters agreed. Trust has been fundamentally broken. Rebuilding it, if that's the direction you choose, would require extraordinary commitment from both of you, particularly Mr. Montgomery. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Harold said immediately. Absolutely anything. Dr. Winters turned to him with a penetrating gaze. Would that include ending your relationship with Elaine Carter, with your children there? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Harold's face contorted with genuine anguish. I don't know if I can abandon my children. They're adults, yes, but they're still my responsibility, my family. Even at the cost of your marriage to Ellie? Dr. Winters pressed. Harold looked stricken, trapped between impossible choices. I hope it doesn't come to that, he said finally. I hope there's a path that doesn't require such an absolute decision. I watched him struggle, feeling a complicated mix of vindication and empathy. The man who had compartmentalized his life so effectively for decades was finally confronting the inherent contradictions of his choices. Mrs. Montgomery, Dr. Winters said, turning to me, is complete severance of Harold's relationship with his other family a requirement for you to consider reconciliation? It was the question I'd been asking myself for weeks, with no clear answer. I don't know, I admitted. I understand that Jason and Sophia are innocent parties in this situation, but I also don't know if I can accept a husband who continues to divide his time, his attention, his affection between two households, even if I'm now aware of it. Dr. Winters nodded thoughtfully. These are difficult questions with no easy answers. For today, I think we've established an important foundation. Mr. Montgomery has acknowledged the selfish nature of his deception, and Mrs. Montgomery has expressed her uncertainty about what form a potential reconciliation might take. She made a few notes on her pad, then looked up at us. For our next session, I'd like each of you to reflect on what your ideal future looks like. Not what you think is possible or practical, but what you truly want if all options were available. This will help us identify where your visions align and where they diverge. As we prepared to leave, Dr. Winters added, "And Mrs. Montgomery, I'd like to meet with you individually before our next joint session, if you're amenable. I think it might be beneficial to explore your feelings in a space where you don't need to consider Mr. Montgomery's reactions." I'd appreciate that, I said, realizing how much I'd been monitoring Harold's expressions, moderating my words to avoid causing further pain even as I processed my own. The drive home was silent, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts. As we pulled into our driveway, Harold finally spoke. "Thank you for going today. I know it wasn't easy." I nodded, acknowledging his gratitude without offering false reassurance. "Dr. Winters seems competent." "She does," he agreed. "Ellie." I meant what I said in there, about doing whatever it takes. I don't know what whatever ultimately means yet. Neither do I admitted. That's why we're going. To counseling. Inside the house, I retreated to the guest room that had become my temporary sanctuary. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I pulled out my phone and called Patricia, who had become my lifeline during this crisis. "How did it go?" she asked without preamble when she answered. "About as well as could be expected," I replied. Harold admitted the deception was selfish, not protective. That's something. Patricia snorted. Took him long enough to state the obvious. Dr. Winters wants to see me individually before our next joint session. Smart woman, Patricia. Approved. You need space to express yourself without worrying about his fragile ego. I smiled despite myself. Patricia's unapologetic loyalty was a balm during this tumultuous time. "Have you heard from Rebecca or Thomas?" "Rebecca called yesterday," I said. "She and Thomas are still planning to come for the family meeting this weekend. Thomas is struggling. Rebecca says he's barely sleeping, alternating between rage and disbelief." "The poor boy," Patricia murmured. "Finding out your father isn't who you thought he was. That's life-altering at any age." "I know," I sighed. "I'm worried about him. About both of them, really. Their entire childhood has been recontextualized by this revelation." We talked for another half hour, Patricia offering the perfect balance of sympathy and practical advice. By the time we hung up, I felt marginally steadier, more capable of facing the family meeting looming on the horizon. The next morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee when Harold appeared in the doorway, an envelope in his hand. "This came for you," he said, placing it on the table and stepping back, maintaining the careful distance we'd established. I recognized Daniel Cooper's law firm letterhead immediately. Inside was a brief note requesting my presence at his office that afternoon to discuss developments related to your recent legal adjustments. Cryptic but clear enough, something had changed regarding the revised will and financial protections I'd put in place. "I need to see Daniel today," I told Harold, not offering details. He nodded, accepting the boundary. "I have a foundation meeting at 2. I should be back by 5. This polite exchange of schedules had replaced our once intimate morning conversations. We moved around each other like wary dance partners, maintaining precise distance while performing the necessary steps of shared living. At Daniel's office that afternoon, his expression was grave as he welcomed me. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Ellie. Please have a seat." "Is something wrong with the revised will?" I asked, getting directly to the point. "Not with the will, no. But there have been some financial movements you should be aware of." My stomach tightened. "What kind of movements?" Daniel opened a folder on his desk. "As you know, we implemented controls requiring your signature for large withdrawals from joint accounts. Yesterday, Harold transferred a significant sum, just under the threshold requiring your approval, from your joint investment account to a separate account at First Community Bank." "How much?" I asked, my voice tight. $4,900, Daniel replied. "The limit we set was $5,000. "That doesn't seem like much given our overall assets," I observed, confused by Daniel's concern. "True, but it's not the amount that concerns me. It's the pattern. This is the third such transfer in 2 weeks, each just below the threshold. Together, they total nearly $15,000. Now I understood his worry. Harold was systematically moving money, carefully staying under the radar of our newly established controls. "Where is the money going?" "That's what I wanted to discuss with you. The recipient account is in the name of Jason Carter." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Harold was sending money to his son, his other son, despite knowing I was monitoring our finances, despite our ongoing counseling, despite everything. "I see," I said, my voice remarkably steady given the turmoil inside. "What are my options?" Daniel outlined several possibilities: lowering the signature threshold, separating our accounts entirely, confronting Harold directly. Each had potential ramifications, both legal and personal. "Before you make any decisions," Daniel advised, "I think you should ask Harold directly about these transfers. There may be an explanation." What possible legitimate explanation could there be for secretly moving money to his son in Riverdale while we're supposedly working on our marriage? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "But a direct conversation might be illuminating, and it would give you firmer ground for whatever actions you decide to take next." I left Daniel's office with a sick feeling in my stomach. The fragile trust I'd been trying to rebuild with Harold, already tenuous at best, felt shattered anew. Despite his claims of commitment to our marriage, he was still operating in secret, still prioritizing his other family. Instead of driving home, I found myself heading toward Pinewood Country Club. I needed neutral territory to process this fresh betrayal, somewhere Harold wouldn't think to look for me if he returned. Early from his meeting, the club's terrace restaurant overlooked the golf course, the manicured greens stretching toward distant hills. I ordered tea and sat at a corner table, watching couples and foursomes enjoy the perfect spring weather. How many of them, I wondered, were hiding significant secrets from their partners? Was anyone truly who they appeared to be? Eleanor Montgomery? The voice pulled me from my dark thoughts. I looked up to see James Parker, a widower who had served on several community boards with Harold over the years. His wife, Catherine, had died of cancer 3 years earlier, a genuine tragedy that had prompted an outpouring of support from the Lakeside community, including a significant donation from the Montgomery Foundation to the oncology wing at Lakeside Memorial Hospital. "James," I said, summoning a polite smile. "How are you?" "Surviving," he replied with the honest simplicity of someone who had endured profound loss. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" I gestured to the empty chair across from me, grateful for the distraction. James ordered coffee from the passing server, then settled back, studying me with kind eyes. "I've heard rumors," he said gently, "about difficulties between you and Harold. Nothing specific, just concerns from mutual friends." I sighed, unsurprised. In a community like Lakeside, significant marital troubles between prominent residents rarely remained completely private. "It's complicated," I acknowledged, unwilling to share details but not denying the core truth. James nodded, accepting my reticence. "I won't pry. But if you need someone to talk to, someone who understands that long marriages contain multitudes, I'm a good listener." His offer, made without expectation or judgment, touched me unexpectedly. "Thank you, James. That's kind." We sat in companionable silence for a moment, then James asked about Rebecca and Thomas, steering the conversation toward safer topics. For the next hour, we chatted about children, community events, books we'd recently read, normal, everyday subjects that temporarily allowed me to step outside the crisis consuming my life. As James prepared to leave, he hesitated, then said quietly, "Whatever you're facing, Eleanor, remember that you've always been more than just Harold Montgomery's wife. You've been a force in your own right, in the classroom, in this community. That doesn't change, regardless of what happens with your marriage." His words stayed with me as I finally drove home, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across Lakeside's tree-lined streets. "You've always been more than just Harold Montgomery's wife." It was true, though I'd sometimes lost sight of that identity during the consuming shock of recent weeks. Harold's car was in the driveway when I arrived, earlier than expected from his foundation meeting. I found him in his study, papers spread across his desk, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. The familiar domestic scene struck me as absurdly normal given the circumstances. "Daniel Cooper called me," he said, without preamble as I appeared in the doorway. "About the transfers to Jason." At least he wasn't denying it. $15,000, Harold, to your son in Riverdale, while we're supposedly working on our marriage." Harold removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose wearily. "It's not what you think, Ellie." "What I think," I said carefully, "is that you're continuing to make unilateral decisions about our joint finances to benefit your second family, deliberately staying just under the limits we established with Daniel. Jason's son, Michael, needs surgery," Harold said, his voice strained. "A specialized procedure for a congenital heart defect. Insurance will cover most of it, but there are significant out-of-pocket expenses. I was helping with those costs." The explanation caught me off guard. A medical emergency for a grandchild, Harold's grandchild. wasn't what I'd expected. Why didn't you tell me? Why make the transfers in secret, staying just under the threshold? Harold's expression was pained. Because I didn't want to put you in the position of having to approve or deny help for a child you've never met. A child who exists because of my betrayal. It seemed cruel to force that choice on you. I sank into a chair, the righteous anger that had fueled me all afternoon dissipating into something more complex. So, instead, you deceived me. Again. Made decisions that affected our joint finances without consulting me. Yes, Harold admitted. I handled it badly. I should have been transparent about the situation, discussed it with you directly. I fell back into old patterns of secrecy instead of embracing the painful honesty we're trying to establish. His self-awareness was coldly impressive, acknowledging his mistake without excusing it, taking responsibility without self-flagellation. It was the kind of mature reflection Dr. Winters was encouraging in our sessions. Tell me about the surgery, I said, surprising myself with the request. Is it serious? Harold looked momentarily startled, then grateful for the opening. Yes. Michael was born with a ventricular septal defect, a hole between the lower chambers of his heart. It's relatively common, but in his case, it's causing significant problems as he grows. The surgery has a high success rate, but it's delicate work, especially in a child so young. When is it scheduled? Next Thursday, Harold said. Jason and his wife are understandably terrified, though they're trying to stay positive for Michael and Emma. I studied Harold's face, the genuine concern in his eyes, the worry lines etched deeper than usual around his mouth. Whatever else he might be, he was a grandfather who cared deeply about his grandchildren, all of them. The next time something like this happens, I said carefully, I expect you to come to me directly. No secret transfers, no staying under thresholds, no unilateral decisions about joint funds. Complete transparency. Is that clear? Harold nodded, visibly relieved. Absolutely clear. And I want regular updates about Michael's condition, I added. Not because I'm monitoring your involvement, but because he's your grandson and his well-being matters to you. So it matters to me too, in some way. The surprise on Harold's face quickly gave way to something like hope. Cautious, tentative but unmistakable. Thank you, Ellie. That means... Thank you. I wasn't offering forgiveness, wasn't suggesting I'd accepted his other family as my own, but I was acknowledging their existence, their importance to him, their basic humanity. It was a small step, but significant in the context of our fractured relationship. I met with James Parker at the club today, I said, changing the subject. He mentioned hearing rumors about difficulties between us. Harold winced. I suppose that was inevitable in a community this size. Yes. We'll need to consider how to handle the public aspects of this situation, whatever we decide privately. The we slipped out automatically, a linguistic remnant of 50 years as a unit. Harold noticed, his expression softening slightly, but he didn't comment on it. Rebecca and Thomas arrive tomorrow, he said instead, for the family meeting. Yes, I've prepared the guest rooms. The looming conversation with our children hung between us. The first time the four of us would be together since the revelation. The first opportunity for Thomas to confront his father directly about the lifetime of deception. I'm afraid, Harold admitted quietly, of losing them, of Thomas never speaking to me again, of Rebecca's disappointment. For the first time since discovering his betrayal, I felt a flicker of genuine empathy for Harold. Not enough to erase the pain he'd caused, but enough to recognize the very real consequences he now faced with our children. They love you, I said. That doesn't disappear overnight, even with something of this magnitude. But they'll need time, Harold. And complete honesty going forward. He nodded, accepting the assessment. Will you... Will you help me navigate this with them? Not defend me, I don't deserve that, but help create space for healing if that's possible. The request surprised me. In our 50 years together, Harold had rarely asked for help, preferring to handle difficult situations through his own competence and charm. This naked vulnerability, this acknowledgement of need, was new. I'll facilitate communication, I said carefully. I won't take sides, won't pressure them one way or another. Their relationships with you are theirs to determine. That's fair, he agreed. More than fair, given the circumstances. We lapsed into silence, the evening sunlight casting long shadows across the study. After a moment, Harold spoke again, his voice hesitant. I was thinking, perhaps we should postpone our next session with Dr. Winters until after the family meeting. Give ourselves time to process whatever happens with Rebecca and Thomas. That's probably wise, I agreed. I'll call her office tomorrow. As I turned to leave, Harold called after me softly. Ellie, thank you for your grace about Michael's surgery, for your willingness to keep trying, despite everything. I paused in the doorway, considering his gratitude. 50 years isn't something you just discard, Harold, even when it's been damaged beyond recognition. Whatever happens next, we share a history that can't be erased. That night, in the guest room that had become my temporary sanctuary, I thought about the complexity of forgiveness, how it wasn't a single decision but a process, unfolding in unexpected ways. I wasn't ready to forgive Harold, wasn't sure I ever would be completely, but I was beginning to recognize that healing might be possible without perfect resolution, that moving forward didn't require forgetting the past. As I drifted toward sleep, my thoughts turned to Rebecca and Thomas, arriving tomorrow to confront this new reality as a family. Their pain was different from mine, the betrayal of a father rather than a husband, but no less profound. Whatever path I ultimately chose for myself, I was determined to help them find their own way through this labyrinth of deception and truth, anger and love, disappointment and possibility. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, uncertainty felt less like an abyss and more like an opening. Painful, yes, but also holding the potential for growth and renewal, whatever form that might take. The morning of the family meeting dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the guest room curtains. I'd been awake for hours, rehearsing what I might say, how I might help navigate the inevitable storm of emotions. I dressed carefully, in a blue silk blouse and tailored slacks, armor of sorts for the difficult day ahead. When I entered the kitchen, Harold was already there, coffee brewed, toast and fruit arranged on a platter. The domestic normalcy of the scene struck me as both comforting and absurd. Rebecca texted, he said, sliding a mug of coffee toward me. Their flight landed on time. They're picking up a rental car and should be here around 11. I nodded, accepting the coffee but declining the food. My stomach was too knotted for breakfast. Thomas was quiet during our last call. Rebecca says he's barely slept all week. Harold's face tightened with concern. I've been trying to prepare for his anger, but you can't, I said simply. This isn't something you can manage or control, Harold. Thomas's feelings are valid, and he deserves the space to express them however he needs to. I know, he admitted quietly. I just hope. I hope there's a path forward, somehow. I studied him, this man I'd loved for 5 decades, who had betrayed me in ways I was still struggling to comprehend. For the first time, I saw not just the confident, capable Harold Montgomery the world knew, but an aging man genuinely terrified of losing his children's love. There's always a path forward, I said, surprising myself with the sentiment. It might not be the one you envision, might not restore what was lost, but there's always a way to move ahead, even through the most difficult terrain. Harold looked up, his eyes meeting mine with naked vulnerability. When did you become so wise, Ellie? Around the time I discovered my entire life wasn't what I thought it was, I replied without bitterness, simply stating a truth we both recognized. At precisely 11 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Harold and I exchanged a glance before moving together to answer it. On the porch stood Rebecca and Thomas, our children, now middle-aged adults with lives and families of their own, yet in this moment looking somehow younger, more vulnerable. Rebecca stepped forward first, embracing me tightly. "Mom," she whispered, the single word conveying volumes. Thomas hung back, his gaze fixed on Harold, his expression a carefully controlled mask. He hugged me briefly when I approached, but his body remained rigid, his attention never fully leaving his father. "Come in," I said, ushering them into the living room where I'd arranged comfortable seating. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I think we should just get started," Thomas said, his voice tight. We settled into our places, Rebecca and Thomas on the sofa, Harold in his usual armchair, me in a chair positioned between them, the mediator by silent agreement. For a long moment, no one spoke. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking the passage of time in a house where time had suddenly become a fluid, unreliable concept. 50 years of marriage, 35 years of deception. The mathematics of betrayal. "I don't even know where to begin," Thomas said finally, breaking the silence. "How do you have a conversation about discovering your entire childhood was built on lies?" "Not everything was a lie," Harold said quietly. "Wasn't it?" Thomas countered, his voice rising slightly. "Every time you claimed to be working late, every business trip that took you away from family events, every sacrifice we were told to accept because Dad was working so hard for our future, those were all lies, weren't they?" Harold didn't flinch from his son's anger. "Yes," he admitted. "Many of those specific instances were lies. But my love for you, for Rebecca, for your mother, that was never false." "How convenient," Thomas scoffed. "The tangible, verifiable parts were lies, but the emotional, unprovable elements were supposedly real." Rebecca placed a hand on her brother's arm. "Tom, let's try to stay calm." "Why?" Thomas demanded, pulling away from her touch. "Why should any of us be calm about this? Do you realize what he's done? For 35 years, 35 years, Becca, he's been leading a double life. He has other children. Children he chose to father even after having us. How are you not furious?" "I am furious," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I'm hurt and shocked and angry. But I'm trying to understand, to process this in a way that doesn't destroy me in the process." She turned to Harold, her expression hardening. "That doesn't mean I excuse what you did, Dad. I don't. What you've done to Mom is unforgivable. The lies you've told all of us. I don't know how to reconcile them with the father I thought I knew." Harold nodded, accepting her words without defense. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I don't deserve it. But I hope, perhaps, for understanding. Not approval, not acceptance of what I did, but recognition that people can make terrible mistakes and still genuinely love their families." "Which family?" Thomas asked bitterly. "The one in Lakeside or the one in Riverdale?" "Both," Harold said simply. "Differently, but genuinely." Thomas stood abruptly, pacing the room as his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. "How is that possible?" he demanded. "How do you compartmentalize your life to that degree? How do you look your children in the eye, all 4 of them, knowing you're living a lie? How do you sleep at night?" "Not easily," Harold admitted. "The deception took a toll, though I didn't fully recognize it until recently. I developed elaborate justifications, convinced myself I was protecting everyone by maintaining the status quo." "Protecting yourself, you mean?" Thomas corrected, sharply. "Yes," Harold agreed. Primarily myself. Dr. Winters, our therapist, has helped me see that more clearly. My choices were fundamentally selfish, motivated by a desire to avoid difficult consequences rather than a genuine concern for others' well-being. His frank admission seemed to momentarily disarm Thomas, who paused in his pacing to study his father with narrowed eyes. And now? Now that everything's exposed? What do you want? Harold glanced at me before answering, a silent acknowledgement that my desires held primacy in this situation. I want to try to repair what can be repaired, he said carefully. With your mother, with both of you. I know some damage may be permanent. I know trust, once broken, may never fully heal. But I want the chance to try. And your other family? Rebecca asked. What happens with them? Harold's expression reflected the impossible position he found himself in. I can't abandon them, he said quietly. Jason and Sophia are my children, just as you are. Their children are my grandchildren, just as yours are. If your mother decides she cannot continue our marriage with that reality, and I would understand completely if that's her decision, then I will accept those consequences. But I cannot simply excise them from my life. The room fell silent as we all absorbed the implications of his statement. Harold was not offering a clean resolution, a neat severing of his other family in favor of ours. He was acknowledging the complex, messy reality he had created, the tangled web of relationships that could not be simply undone. Have you met them? Thomas asked suddenly, turning to me. These other children of his? I've met Jason, I confirmed, and Elaine. And, Thomas pressed. I considered my answer carefully. Jason seems like a decent man, thoughtful, well-spoken. His son, Michael, is having heart surgery next week. That's why your father has been transferring money to Jason's account. The revelation about Michael's surgery visibly affected both Rebecca and Thomas. Whatever their anger toward Harold, the thought of a sick child, their half-brother's son, introduced a human element to what had been an abstract betrayal. Is it serious? Rebecca asked, her professional composure momentarily displaced by genuine concern. Yes, Harold said, a ventricular septal defect. The surgery has a good prognosis, but it's still frightening for Jason and his wife. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, that gesture so like Harold's, and sank back onto the sofa. This is surreal, he muttered. We're sitting here discussing our secret half-brother's son's heart condition like it's normal family news. None of this is normal, I acknowledged. We're in uncharted territory as a family. There's no roadmap for navigating this kind of revelation. What do you want, Mom? Rebecca asked, turning to me with eyes so like my own. Through all this, what outcome are you hoping for? It was the question Dr. Winters had posed in our session, the one I'd been grappling with privately for weeks. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? Reconciliation? A clean break? Something else entirely? I want peace, I said finally. Not the false peace of ignorance that I lived with for decades, but genuine peace based on truth. What form that takes, I'm still discovering. Your father and I are in counseling, trying to understand if there's a version of our marriage that can survive this revelation. And if there isn't? Thomas asked quietly. Then I'll build a new life, I said with more confidence than I'd expected to feel. At 72, that's not what I anticipated. But I've discovered I'm stronger than I knew. You've always been strong, Mom, Rebecca said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. That's never been in question. The conversation continued for hours, circling through anger, grief, confusion, and brief moments of tentative connection. Thomas remained the most resistant, his sense of betrayal cutting deepest. Rebecca, while equally hurt, seemed more able to separate her relationship with Harold from his actions, to consider the possibility of a future connection without dismissing the gravity of his deception. By late afternoon, we had reached a kind of temporary equilibrium, not resolution, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement of where we stood and the long road ahead. Thomas agreed to meet with Harold individually the following day, a step I considered significant progress given his initial fury. As Rebecca helped me prepare dinner, she asked quietly, "Have you considered meeting Sophia, Harold's daughter?" The question startled me. Not specifically, no. Meeting Jason and Elaine was challenging enough. "I've been thinking about it," Rebecca admitted, her hands busy chopping vegetables. "About possibly meeting them, Jason and Sophia. Not immediately, but eventually. There are half-siblings after all. We share DNA, a father." "You don't have to do that for my sake," I said carefully. "Or for your father's." "It wouldn't be for either of you," she clarified. "It would be for me. To understand this situation fully, to see these people who are connected to us whether we chose it or not." Her perspective surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Rebecca had always been the diplomat of the family, the one who could see multiple sides of complex situations. Her ability to consider reaching out to Harold's other children reflected a maturity I admired, even as I struggled with the idea myself. That evening, after Rebecca and Thomas had retired to their childhood bedrooms, I found myself on the back porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Harold appeared in the doorway, hesitating before joining me. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. I nodded, and he settled beside me, maintaining a respectful distance. For several minutes we sat in silence, the chirping of crickets the only sound in the gathering dusk. "Thomas has agreed to meet with me tomorrow," Harold said finally. "Just the two of us." "I know. That's a positive step." Harold nodded, his profile illuminated by the porch light. "He may never forgive me fully. I understand that." "Forgiveness isn't something you're entitled to," I said, my voice gentle despite the hard truth. "It's a gift, freely given or withheld." "I know," he agreed. "I'm prepared to spend the rest of my life earning back whatever trust is possible, with all of you." But we lapsed into silence again, the weight of 50 years and 35 years of lies hanging between us. Finally, Harold spoke again, his voice barely audible. "Ellie, whatever you decide about our marriage, I want you to know something. These past weeks, seeing your strength, your dignity in handling this impossible situation, I've never admired you more." The irony of his admiration emerging from the ruins of his betrayal wasn't lost on me. "That's a complicated statement, Harold." "I know," he acknowledged, "but it's true nonetheless." 2 days later, after emotional individual conversations between Harold and each of our children, Rebecca and Thomas prepared to return to their respective homes. The visit had been exhausting for everyone, but productive in establishing a tentative framework for moving forward. Regular family therapy sessions via video conference, individual relationships proceeding at their own pace, a commitment to honesty even when painful. As we stood on the porch saying goodbye, Thomas pulled me aside while Harold helped Rebecca with her luggage. "Are you going to be okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice low. "Really okay?" I studied my son's face, so like Harold's in structure, yet uniquely his own in expression. "Yes," I said with genuine confidence. "Whatever happens with your father and me, I'll be okay." "You could come stay with me in Boston for a while," he offered. "Get some distance, some perspective." I smiled, touched by his protective instinct. "Thank you. But I need to work through this here, in the life I've built. Running away won't provide the answers I'm seeking." Thomas nodded, respecting my decision, though concern still shadowed his eyes. "Just promise you'll put yourself first for once, your happiness, your well-being. Not his, not ours, not anyone else's." "I promise," I said, and meant it. After they departed, the house felt simultaneously emptier and lighter, as if some of the suffocating tension had dissipated, allowing space for new possibilities to emerge. Harold retreated to his study, giving me room to breathe, to process the emotional intensity of the past few days. That evening, I called Daniel Cooper and scheduled an appointment for the following week. The time had come to make decisions about my financial future, regardless of what happened with my marriage. If Harold and I found a way forward together, I would still maintain independent control of my assets. If we ultimately separated, I would do so from a position of strength and clarity. 3 days later, I received a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Montgomery, this is Jason Carter. I wanted to let you know that Michael's surgery went well. He's in recovery now and the doctors are optimistic. Thank you for your concern." I stared at the message, surprised not only that Jason had reached out to me directly, but that he assumed. Harold had shared information about my interest in Michael's well-being. The simple text message represented yet another thread in the complex tapestry of connections that now existed, whether I had chosen them or not. After careful consideration, I replied, "Thank you for letting me know, Jason. I'm glad to hear Michael is recovering well. Please give him my best wishes." It wasn't an embrace of this unwanted extended family, wasn't forgiveness for the decades of deception, but it was an acknowledgement of our shared humanity, of the innocent child at the center of this particular moment. That night, as I prepared for bed in the guest room that had become my sanctuary, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past month. From the shocking discovery of the yellow envelope, to the painful confrontations, the legal maneuvering, the family meeting, the ongoing therapy, it had been a transformation as profound as any in my 72 years. The woman who had opened that envelope no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, more clear-eyed, more determined to live authentically for whatever years remained. I didn't yet know if that authentic life would include Harold as my husband, but I knew with absolute certainty that it would be a life of my own choosing, not one built on someone else's lies. 2 months later, standing on the shore of Lake Michigan near our summer cottage, I made my decision. Harold and I had continued therapy, both together and separately. We had established new boundaries, new expectations, new patterns of interaction. He had demonstrated consistent honesty, even when difficult. I had reclaimed my independent identity while acknowledging our shared history. Michael had recovered fully from his surgery. Thomas had begun tentative, limited communication with Harold. Rebecca had met Jason for coffee during a business trip to Riverdale, a meeting she described as surreal but not terrible. Our extended family was finding its way toward a new normal, however unconventional. As the waves lapped gently at the shore, I turned to Harold, who stood beside me watching the sunset with anxious eyes. He had asked me to meet him here, at the place where we had spent so many summer days with our young family, to hear my decision about our marriage. "I've decided to stay," I said simply. Not because I've forgotten or fully forgiven, but because 50 years of shared life deserves the chance to evolve into something new. Relief washed over his face, followed immediately by solemn gratitude. "Thank you, Ellie. I promise." I held up a hand, stopping his flow of promises. "This isn't unconditional, Harold. I have terms." He nodded, waiting. "First, I maintain financial independence. The changes I've made with Daniel remain in place permanently. Second, complete transparency about your time with Elaine and her family, no secrecy, no surprises. Third, we continue therapy for as long as necessary. And fourth, we renew our vows, not to celebrate what was, but to acknowledge what is and what can be." Harold considered these terms carefully, understanding their significance. This wasn't a return to our former marriage, but the creation of something entirely new, A relationship between equals, with clear boundaries and expectations. I accept, he said finally. All of it. As the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Not the blind contentment of ignorance, but the hard-won serenity of someone who had faced devastating truth and emerged stronger, wiser, more fully herself. My journey wasn't over. The reverberations of Harold's deception would continue to shape our family for years to come. But standing on that shore, watching day transition into night, I knew I had found my way forward through the wreckage of betrayal to solid ground again. At 72, I had rewritten the story of my life, not erasing the painful chapters, but adding new ones of my own creation. Whatever came next would be authentic, honest, and most importantly, mine to choose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.